everybody. I'm Jane Hansen. This week in the arena, with the recent increase of deadly natural disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and volcanic eruptions, a lot of people are looking at these events and seeing them as obvious signs of the biblical end of times. So what are these specific signs, and are they, in fact, biblical? And are we really approaching the end of the world? Joining us now, Monsignor Kieran Harrington, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn, and our in-studio guest, Father Jonathan Morris, Fox News analyst and author of God Wants You Happy. Plus, our special guest via Skype from Boston, Massachusetts is Dr. Tim Muldoon, theologian, author, and professor in the honors program at Boston College. And, of course, Grant Galicio, who is an associate editor at Commonweal magazine. All right, Father, let's start with you.
All righty.
Look at all these signs, and people are saying there's a fascination out there going, what are we supposed to take from this?
You know, the other day I was driving along a road, and there was a van that had this sign on one of the windows that said, May 22nd is it. End of times, the day of reckoning. This is it. And I thought to myself, I wonder what that guy is going through on a personal level, right? Imagine what he might be going through,
Yeah,
right?
because that's 2 months.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's his days are coming to the end, and perhaps he's getting things in order. Perhaps he's fixing relationships in a very good thing. But also, my guess is that he's missing out on doing a lot of wonderful things for a lot of people and building the life that God has given us to build. I think it's very clear in the Scripture. We do not know the day or the hour. And if we live as if we do, we're going to be missing out on a lot of very good things.
Yeah, but what if it forces us to actually do some things that we should have been doing a long time ago?
Building the life that God has planned for us?
Yeah.
I don't think that's what God wants us to do, just take advantage of today. God has given us a life, and we have a mission. And looking forward to fulfilling that mission takes planning, and it requires an investment in the future.
What's the purpose then of apocalyptic literature?
Well, I think a lot of it is a big waste, and I think it's a big distraction. What we know about eschatology, and I'm sure the professor Boston College is going to be able to help us out a lot on that, what we know about eschatology is really very little, quite honestly, compared to almost any other field of theology.
So when we talk about eschatology, let's get an explanation of exactly what that means. Dr. Muldoon?
Yes, eschatology, one of my favorite words. My students love saying it. It comes from the Greek word eschaton, which just means end, referring to the end times. So eschatology is the study of what we can say about the end times. And I think Father's right, not a lot at all. The best we can do is look at our textual tradition. We look at our biblical texts. And specifically, we're talking about two main books, namely the book of Daniel in the Old Testament and the book of Revelation in the New Testament, neither of which give us a template for what to expect vis-a-vis the end times. The best they give us is what first century Christians thought about the end times, and that should at least give us some idea, but it's not exactly a recipe for the signs to look for in our world.
Okay, but wait a minute. You go on the internet and you Google this stuff, and what you get is, at no time in history have there been more changes that have occurred in science and the political structure of the world. There have never been more natural disasters, etc., etc., etc. And it's quite scary, Doctor.
Yeah, it is. It's compelling. My own sense of that is we know about these things more than at any other time in history. We've got an internet. Look, we can know about tsunamis as they are happening. We can watch live streaming video and say, oh my God, this is really scary to watch. Most people in history simply never experienced that kind of real-time understanding of these dire events. So I think in the aggregate, we say we got all this evidence. But my sense is it's not that the evidence wasn't there in the past, it's that people didn't know about it.
I think that we have to just also recognize, though, that apocalyptic literature is very, very compelling for a lot of people. Tim LaHaye wrote a whole series, the Left Behind series, all about apocalyptic literature. So from my perspective, and this is where I would think, the early Christian church believed that the parousia was happening, the second coming of Christ was going to happen in their own time. I kind of look at my life as having to live my life as though Christ is going to come again. So I would see my own living out of my life as that I have to live in a state of readiness for when Christ comes.
I think it's a great point, and we can't poo-poo the whole apocalyptic literature, as you say, because it is founded on the words of Jesus himself. Right? You go to the 24th chapter of Matthew, or it's throughout Matthew and Mark and Luke as well, and we see that Jesus was saying there will be an end of times. This is not it. This is not where eternity is going to take place necessarily, but rather that there is an end of times in which God is going to bring forth a new existence for us. And so I think, like you said, Monsignor, we have to live as if these are end times in terms of our relationship with God and others.
Well, wait a minute. Come on. We all know as we go through life that we are all facing death.
That's true.
Okay,
Jane. That's
so
the end. That's the real end times,
of our
right?
time.
That's the real end times.
So what's the difference?
The big difference for me is that the apocalyptic literature that we're speaking about arose out of a particular historical context of persecution in the early church. And so, you look at somebody like John, the author of the book of Revelation, and he's sending a recurring message throughout that book, and he's saying, look, fellow Christians, God is in charge here. There are things we can look at in our understanding of who Jesus was that remind us that whatever the signs are now, whoever's persecuting us, whatever kind of disasters are happening, God is still in charge. And so, these books that I mentioned, Daniel, Revelation, are ways of saying, don't forget that. Don't forget to live that in a way that reminds us that God is in charge. Live with faith, anticipate, we don't know exactly when, but always live mindful that we are answerable to God. That to me is the key message from those texts.
Grant, you sitting here shaking your head yes. What are you trying to tell us?
I'm thinking that, I find it a little scary when people go out saying that the end of days are upon us because there have been earthquakes and natural disasters. But the church owes a great debt to Paul, who really believed that the eschaton was there, and we wouldn't have much of a church now if Paul wasn't motivated.
Right. He basically said, don't get married. For that reason. So he said, if you can afford not to get married, don't get married. If you're going to fall into sin, then you should get married. But basically, the reason why he was advocating people shouldn't get married is because they should be in the state of readiness for when Christ comes again.
All right. So here's the question then: when people look at all these natural disasters and they say, "We think to us that they have magnified," I want to ask you, Dr. Muldoon, and you, Father Morris, is God angry? Is that why we're seeing more of it? Doctor?
You want to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is God angry? Well, look, there's a theme of judgment that runs through the Gospels. It runs through some of Paul's writings. We don't want to ignore that is a theme. And in fact, it's even more pronounced, arguably, in some of the Old Testament literature. So we don't want to say that God is never angry with us. There is a theme of judgment. And so on one hand, we'd say yes, but on the other hand, the same author, John, who brings us this dramatic language about divine judgment and punishment and all the rest, also has that wonderful letter of first, that we know as 1 John, in which God is love. And so, you have to see those things together, that love and judgment are not themselves mutually exclusive propositions, that God judges us because he loves us. He wants to call us to holiness. And so it's not entirely a doom and gloom, woe is us kind of posture. It's very much balanced by that, this judgment is because God cares about us and is calling us to greater life, and therefore is going to hold us to the standard of holiness.
Sure. I think the reason why the idea of God being angry is so scary to us is because we think of our own anger, and it's usually out of control emotion. God doesn't have out-of-control emotion. He's not getting revenge. He's not, you did this to me, I'm going to get you. And very often we think of that and we get a little bit scared. If God's going to get revenge, it's going to be pretty good, right? Yeah. And that's not the way God relates to us. It's and I think the doctor brought this point out, that judgment and love go hand in hand, and the judgment is actually about bringing us to the point in which we can be in that eternal embrace of love and friendship with God, our loving Father. And so it's not all that bad.
Point well taken. Okay, we have to take a break.
Alrighty.
But I have a bunch of more questions, so we'll be back in just a second. And we want to invite you to weigh in on our discussion anytime by going to our website at netny.net and click on Enter the Arena. We welcome your questions and comments, and we'll be right back. Welcome back as we continue our discussion on natural disasters and signs of the end of times. We are joined again in studio by Father Jonathan Morris, Fox News analyst and author of God Wants You Happy. Plus, our special guest via Skype from Boston is Dr. Tim Muldoon, theologian, author, and professor in the honors program at Boston College. And, of course, we've got Monsignor Harrington and Grant Galicio from Commonweal Magazine. So we were just talking about God and God being angry, but here's the question. Some of these disasters that have happened, like 9/11 and other terrorist attacks, are man-made. They are not God. So is it possible that man-made disasters could help us lead towards this end of time?
Sure. And I think Monsignor brought up a great point in the break about whether it's man-made or God-made, so to speak. Sometimes they do feel out of control, right? Absolutely out of control.
Yeah, I think that for all of us, I think that when disaster strikes, whether it is September 11th or whether it's a tsunami that affects 10,000 people in Japan, there is a massive concern about is God expressing his anger towards me? And we know historically, or at least we believe, right, through the scriptures, that God did destroy his creation because he was angry.
But don't we also believe that with the coming of the Messiah, that things will be righted? That it's not necessarily, God is going to send another flood. I mean, there was the rainbow, but that we will see a.
But there is judgment. But there is judgment.
Yes,
the separation of the sheep from the goats. I mean, there is this notion that there is going to be a tribulation.
I imagine people like at home going, "Oh my gosh!" And it's a little bit like watching it. Our fascination with it is a little bit like watching Charlie Sheen, I think, or watching Jersey Shore, right? There's this element of this train wreck about to happen, and we can get paralyzed. And I think you brought up a great point, Jane, that most of our suffering is actually human provoked. It's us making bad decisions or other people making bad decisions. And God has given us that tremendous gift of free will that we can say now, no matter what happens in the end times or at the end of my days, I'm going to make the best of it, and that's the choice of a Christian.
Dr. Muldoon, weigh in here.
The thing that is running through my mind is an old distinction that's found among moral theologians. Without getting too technical, the idea is that there is such a thing as evil, which just kind of happens because nobody planned it. So I'm thinking of your flood, your earthquake kind of thing. And then there's the kind that is provoked by human beings. If you want the terms, it's ontic evil and moral evil. So moral evil is when people, free creatures like us, just choose to do evil things. We hurt each other, we kill each other. So 9/11, we can say, is an act of evil people doing evil things. And that's one entirely different category from, when a natural disaster happens. I mean, even in our insurance language, we call it an act of God. So we want to put, it's God's fault. It's all on God. And I think both, though, at least the similarity is that we feel out of control. And that to me is the issue. Now, my comeback, and I'll invite others to weigh in, but my comeback is, look, if we understand a basic point, namely that this world is not ours, we didn't invent it, we didn't get to choose to be here, it's God's world, then we at least have to temper that sense of being out of control. Of course we're out of control. But if God is Lord of heaven and earth, then in a certain sense we expect that, and we also in our faith say, He's got the bigger picture in mind. We may not understand why the disasters happen, but he's got the bigger picture in mind.
I love that. Theology professor with faith.
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
Unique. But what about this notion that even the natural disasters mankind may partially be responsible for because of things like global warming and all of that our practices and the way that we have operated is actually helping these quote-unquote acts of God?
And that's why I think... in losing a notion of sin, we sort of fail to see that. If we understand sin to be an interruption in the way that we're supposed to be relating to God, then, I think about the environmental issues. I think your example is a good one. If we're doing things to our environment that are creating conditions that make natural disasters more prevalent, then we need to wake up and say, wait a minute, we're doing something wrong here. Let's put it this way. It's not enough to talk about an individual relationship with God. It starts to look like a really global issue. But my point, I think, is that at least in our Catholic history, we've always recognized that we're not just an individual one-on-one relationship with God. It really is that we're all implicated in this. And it raises a host of different questions beyond just, am I feeling like I did something wrong? It's asking big system wide question.
Well, then also, again, getting back to the stuff you can find on the internet, when you Google this end of times thing, you read things like, what has been sacred, all that has been sacred in our lives has been unzipped, which is an actual quote. There's all this increase in stress and confusion and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all signs that we are getting towards the end of time. How do you respond to that?
I think that a lot of people, especially if you live in 21st century America or the Western world, right, you look around and you say, there seems to be a lot of sin. There seems to be a lot that God would be angry with, right? So the number of children whose lives are taken because of abortion, same-sex marriage, immoral living, people living together without being married. All these things where there seem to be a lot of biblical injunctions that against living in an immoral way, it seems like the Western world has embraced. And so a lot of people look at that and say, now they put the natural disasters in the context of how we are living and kind of anticipate God's wrath. And I think there is good reason to do that. Isaiah, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah speak to God's anger at the way in which the people were living. They take up idolatry.
But that was thousands of years ago.
But the Word of God is a living word. It's not something that is a history book that is we look at. It's something that is speaking to you and to me today. And so I think that there is cause for optimism, because if we take a look at God's mercy and God's justice, one just man, and he saves the city. But for you and for me, I think the challenge is to read apocalyptic literature, to look at end times and say, this really has to focus me in terms of my relationship with God, in terms of how I am called to live in the Christian community, how the Christian community is really called to live, to be a leaven in the midst of the world.
I want to talk with Dr. Muldoon now about something called the tribulation theory and how that plays into all of this.
It's a theory that is much more common in evangelical circles. It is drawn from a reading of the book of Revelation and even some other related texts. The basic idea is that there's a testing period that leads up to the end of days and the second coming of Christ. The problem that I have with trying to explain that too much is it's focusing on a reading of Revelation that I don't think works in as easy a way as it may seem. I said it earlier that John, the author, was trying to read the signs of the times in the late first century and say, here are some things we need to be aware of as a Christian community to remind ourselves of God being in charge. I don't think you can transpose those ideas into the 21st century and say that there's a one-to-one correlation. So the tribulation, again, it's there in modern church history. By the way, you don't find this notion in the ancient church, which is a big clue, at least for Catholics and Orthodox especially, that this doesn't really represent the tradition as we understand.
Tim, just a question: doesn't but the notion of tribulation kind of is caught up with the notion of the rapture, right?
That's
and
right.
So, on some level, it's almost like giving people a second chance, because if you're a faithful Christian, you're caught up in the cloud. But if you're kind of not a faithful Christian, you got a second chance at coming to
That's
know
right.
Christ.
That's what
That's right.
rapture is? That's the theory of rapture?
Well, the theory of the rapture is that if you're faithful, you're a believing Christian, you're caught up into the cloud, so you don't have to go through the tribulation.
Right.
If you're
You're
kind of
At the same time, St. Paul, who talks a lot about tribulation because he went through tribulation, he says in the book of Romans, he talks about God's love and presence always being with us even in the midst of that tribulation. And so that's the good news. We can get so caught up of the fear of what's going to happen to me, and God saying, my love is sufficient, my grace is sufficient. Yeah. We have to get on and say, I'm going to spend my life, every living bit of it, every living bit of my life. I don't know if that makes sense.
Every
bit of my life doing good and embracing my friendship and relationship with God, and not get too caught up in what's certainly very fascinating but not necessarily very edifying.
Leading me to this question, I'm not sure how it goes, but the Battle of Armageddon and what the Bible teaches us about that.
It is.
He's like,
strictly speaking, it's a text again in the book of Revelation. What does Armageddon refer to? It may be that it refers to the plain of Megiddo, which was outside of Jerusalem. So it may have been a very specific reference that John was talking about. It's one of these great images that Hollywood loves. Armageddon and video gamers love the whole idea of there being this last kind of battle. So the image is that there is a last battle. A consummation of history, if you want, and of course, the good guy wins in the end. So let's put it this way. Aesthetically, and I mean, just in terms of the way that it captures our imagination, it's a really, really compelling notion. Now, can we plan, do we need to create a war room and plan the Battle of Armageddon? I wouldn't be part of that conversation. I don't see that happening. To me, it's much more indicative of a strain of Christian imagination from the beginning that is reinforcing God is in charge.
And would that be your last thought here, Dr. Muldoon, that God is in charge?
It's the thought to me that has to be pervasive when we confront natural disasters. We can't understand them. But in our faith, we say that God knows what's happening. God is comforting those who are affected by these tragedies and is reminding us in hope that there is a larger story at work and only God knows it.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Muldoon. Father, last words?
Trust in God. That's, trust in God. And every single fear about the future, we can turn that over to God and say, God, I'm afraid, but here it is. I love you. Help me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for being with us. We are going to take a final break, but we'll continue our discussion with some last thoughts about the end of times in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. Continuing our conversation on the end of times, we're joined once again by Monsignor Kieran Harrington, the Director of Communications for the Diocese of Brooklyn. And our regular contributor is Elizabeth Scalia, Managing Editor of the Catholic Portal at Patheos.com, and Grant Galicio, Associate Editor of Commonweal Magazine. All right, Elizabeth, you were listening to all of this. Should we live in fear that we're at the end of time, or should we just dismiss all of this and take it for what it is?
Oh, you could be dead 5 minutes from now. What's the point? I've never gotten it. It's never thrilled me. My mother was one of these last days people. She fed me end time stuff with my breakfast cereal, and she kept telling me the world is going to end in the year 2000. And I would think, God, I'm only going to be 48. And 42, I couldn't do math then either. But
You're lying about your age, come on.
But I seriously have always had a lot of difficulty taking people seriously. That said, I had an atheist friend of mine call me up after the Japan earthquake and said, I just read that the country was moved 8 feet. Is this the end of the world? And I was like, who knows?
Grant?
I don't get it either. I mean, I think if you were fed this with your cereal, I mean, I think one of the reasons this kind of literature is so popular is because it tastes good. It's very exciting. It's like, the end of days are upon us. How can we make sense of this thing? Well, it's the end of the world, and let's write a series of books that will sell millions of copies. Let's get people worked up about whether there's 1 week left or 2 weeks. Let's get them selling their gold. I mean, I think that hucksters can use this kind of theology to manipulate people into getting rid of their stuff and making a big profit off of them.
I think some of this is just that people enjoy high drama and hyperventilating about things. We had a guest on the other week, Bobby Petrocelli, who said something about how you can get it all enervated about the chaos, and you can thrust yourself into the hype and the chaos and all of that other stuff, and it makes you feel like you're energized, but it's really very empty. And ultimately negative. And I think that's what this is.
And to the point about the movies and Armageddon in the movies, that sort of thing, in the end, people still live, which is if it were truly the end of time.
Everybody but Bruce Willis.
Yeah, everybody but Bruce Willis. Okay, Father.
I'm the contrarian here. I think that apocalyptic literature is important. I think there's a reason why in the providence of God, Revelation is the last book of the Bible. I certainly don't think it should be overblown in terms of how we live our life in this sort of fear. And I do agree with Grant that there can be kind of hucksters. And yet I think that maybe we have really missed the point that God does get angry with our sinfulness. And, there is a lot to be angry about. If you take a look at how the third world has been exploited by the first world. I mean, this is certainly the exploitation of the widow and the orphan. I mean, we kind of don't want to recognize that there is evil in the world, and God is outraged by evil, and God is going to call that evil to account. Now, that doesn't mean that I live in a sense of this fear of God, terror of God, but at the same time, I have to recognize that my actions have a consequence. They matter for me and for history.
So what is it then that the average person who's watching right now should take away from all of this?
I think that we live our life as though in the next moment we stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And that changes the way in which you live your life. If here's the thing is that I'm the kind of guy who puts off for tomorrow all the time. I got to lose 20 pounds. I kind of wait, I'm going to start on Sunday. No. I got to start today, right now. This is what's going to change my life. I can't keep putting it off and putting it off, because if I keep putting it off, it never happens. And I think that the purpose of the apocalyptic literature in scriptures is to say, get going now, because, tomorrow it is all over.
But that's also true in our lives, whether we're talking end times or we're talking about just the fact that we could keel over. Archbishop Sheen used to say the same thing. In a blink of an eye, you have to live like in a blink of an eye, you could be gone. And, that's probably what we should take away from it. And the other side of that is, hokey as it sounds, and I really don't like the song, but there's a song called Let Peace Begin With Me.
Sing it.
You don't want that. But,
which
but it's profound. In that stupid, simple message, it's true.
You think about September 11th as a New Yorker, right? And I worked at the World Trade Center before I was a priest. And I was thinking to myself, I know all the routines these guys are going through. Not overnight, just in a few minutes, the world completely changed for all the people who were in that building. Mm-hmm. In Japan, in the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
Right. So we need to take the lessons that we can from what we see and take it into our life. Last thoughts, Grant?
To the extent that apocalyptic literature helps us to focus on our own failings and the role in our community in order to make it better, it's good. To the extent that it causes us to prey on people who may be confused about their own place in the world, it's bad. I think we need to be comfortable with mystery, and that what's happening online right now with this end of days stuff is a kind of cheap excuse, a cheap explanation.
Elizabeth?
Don't tell your kids the world's going to end in 2012. They'll stop studying.
Monsignor?
We don't know the day or the hour, but we always must be ready.
Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being with us. And remember that you don't need a TV to watch The Net. We are always online at netny.net. For all of us here, I'm Jane Hanson. We'll see you next time in the arena.